ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Lunch and Learn for June. I'm John Zimkus, the Education Director and Historian here at the Harmon Museum, run by the Warren County Historical Society. We have first off, I want to thank you all for being here. This is a great crowd. I think this is the largest crowd we've had in many, a couple of years, I think. We have some things coming up I think you might be interested in. While you're here, of course, admission to the museum is free. We have a new art show. It's the photography of Bill and Marty Welsh, who are from Southwest Ohio, Wildlife and Wild Places. And they're photographs and they're absolutely beautiful. We normally have an opening day reception. They couldn't come because they were out in the wilderness taking photographs. So we're going to have a closing reception on July 21st, which is free to the public. So if you'd like to come to the reception and meet the photographers, you can do that. But that is on the floor 1, the main floor of the Harmon Museum. So if you go down the ramp and turn to the right into the transportation room, go to the elevator where the train is, press 1, it'll open up straight to the photography and you will love it. There are staying with the art theme, there's a combination of art contest and art competition and honoring the Golden Lamb. The Golden Lamb will be celebrating its 220th anniversary this December, beginning as a log cabin tavern. And then the structure we have today is, the oldest part is 1815, but there was a log cabin Golden Lamb on that same lot. I am, besides being the education director and historian here, I'm also the historian at the Golden Lamb. So if you come tonight between 6 and 8, I might visit you at your table and say, hi, would you like to hear some stories about the Golden Lamb? So I will change my name tag though. Some of the same stories, different name tag. The competition, first place is $500, second place $300, third place $100. They'll be on display in the Golden Lamb. These are getting artwork of the Golden Lamb. For years, the Golden Lamb used to commission a new piece of art every year, but now they're going to have a competition. So if you know some artists who want to do a view of the Golden Lamb in some aspect, either currently or from the past, think about the competition. The exhibition date will be October 27th of 23 through January 6th. The applications are due by August 26th. So you have about 2 months if you know anybody who's interested in that competition. We also have something I've been doing now for 30 years, and that is the history camp here at the Harmon Museum. Our topic this year is Herstory, Pioneering Women of Southwest Ohio. We're going to be looking at the role women have played currently and also in the past. Sometimes they met great obstacles. The obstacles could be people didn't want a woman to succeed in the business they were in. The obstacle also could have been the loss of a husband or something of that nature, and then they had to step into position and the success they had. We will have 2 historic portrayals of local historic people. Elizabeth Kimberlin, who was an African-American woman who grew up here in Warren County in Lebanon, worked for the federal government, but also as a Girl Scout leader out of Lebanon, helped integrate Camp Butterworth in southern Warren County in the 1940s. We will also have another portrayal of Mary Craig Dunleavy, the wife of Francis Dunleavy, the first teacher in the Miami Valley, and how she is recognized today as the first war nurse from the American Revolution in Ohio. So some fascinating stories there. We will visit the Pioneer Cemetery and the Lebanon Cemetery to visit the resting place of women who've made a mark. We will also visit the County Administration Building, talk to the head of the Recorder's Office, Linda Oder, talk to Tiffany Zindel, the County Administrator, who also happened to be a former student of mine. Who is the first female head of the administrator. You know, the commissioners may make the rules, but the administrator is the one who does all the hard work, you know. So she's the one who gets things done. So that will be Monday, July 10th through Thursday, July 13th. For children entering 4th grade to entering 8th, if the family is a member of the Historical Society, it's $55 for 4 days. If they're not a member, it's $75. If you know somebody of that age who would like to learn more about Warren County history, please let them know about the history camp. As far as lunch and learns go, on July 19th, Tom Calarco will be our speaker. He's going to talk about Orson Murray. Tom wrote this book on the Underground Railroad in South Central Ohio. And he's researching a book on Orson Murray. Orson Murray, talking about Camp Butterworth, lived in Foster, not far from where Camp Butterworth is. And he was a man ahead of his time. He was a free thinker. He was a beatnik or a hippie 160 years ago. There's a picture of him in our Underground Railroad display. I always compare him to Rip Van Winkle after waking up after 20 years, or maybe a drunken Santa Claus. But if you go down in the Underground Railroad display, you can't miss him with the description I just gave you. But he was part of the Underground Railroad. He also was talking about free thinking, talking about better food for our bodies, long before that sort of thing became popular. On August 16th, Kim Villalva will be here talking about Civil War women and how these women felt they had a duty and then succeeded in achieving greatness during the Civil War. Alex Villalva, I'm pronouncing his last name wrong, I apologize. Her husband will be our speaker in September, and he'll be talking about honoring America's dead from wars and the Arlington Cemetery and the role it plays. Our very own Jeannie Doan will be talking about, I believe the title is Color Me This. Is that right, Jeannie?
Color Our World.
Color Our World. Okay, well, I had color right. Yeah. Yeah. The role that dyes, where dyes came from, how dyes were expensive, how people traded in dyes, and how there were near conflicts over dyes, and that sort of thing. That will be October 18th. October 15th, I will have the pleasure of being your speaker. I'm going to talk, as you know, Veterans Day was originally called Armistice Day, the ending of World War I, or back in those days, the Great War. They didn't know they had to number them. But Armistice Day, when they signed the treaty, when conflict stopped in Europe, what happened in Lebanon when they heard the news? What did they do? What kind of celebrations they had? So we'll be exploring 100 years ago plus what Lebanon did when it heard that World War I, the Great War, was over. Our good friend Fred Compton will be here on December 13th talking about A Dickens Christmas. Another good friend, Joyce Browning, she's the one who portrays all these fantastic female characters in history. From Annie Oakley, she'll be in history camp with Mary Craig Dunleavy. A new person she takes the role of is Julia Dent, the wife of U.S. Grant. A woman from St. Louis whose father was a die-hard Confederate sympathizer, and how her husband led the Union Army during the Civil War, and the conflict she had. And then when her husband became president, her father came to live with him at the White House, and what kind of conflict that brought about. February 21st, I've just been talking this past week or two with Donna Summers, who is a major fan and a major contributor to the Historical Society here. She's the one who curates the Armstrong Gallery of Flight. She's going to do something she has a passion about: Tiffany's. She has recently been involved on Jekyll Island, getting some Tiffany windows replaced and fixed up and what have you. And she is excited about doing a whole presentation on Tiffany. And then Linda Martin is here in March 20th. Linda is the one who every year or so cleans out part of her basement and brings it here for us to see. You know, a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, it was Halloween, and she actually did it twice rather. Once for a presentation which we really couldn't put on the air. It was great, but technical difficulty stopped that. But when the COVID restrictions were lifted, she did a fantastic thing on all the things she had collected for Halloween. And then a year or so later, she said, well, you know, I've got Christmas things too. Well, then we had her for Christmas. And then just after Christmas, she says, well, you know, John, I've got Easter things too. So now we're going to see her Easter collection, going back 30, 40, perhaps even longer in time. So some exciting things are going to be happening for our Lunch and Learn. Hopefully you will continue to come join us. Always remember that when you are here, there is free admission to the museum, plus there's a discount for you at our gift shop. So enjoy your meal. I'm about to start mine, and we'll have our speaker in about 15, 20 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the June Lunch and Learn here at the Harmon Museum. As I mentioned earlier, I am John Zimkus. I am the Education Director and Historian here, and it is my privilege to introduce our speaker today. I knew Suzanne Taylor back when she was Suzanne Anderson, and she was a student teacher of mine, which I think is approaching 30 years ago. It is past 30. Okay, I got to sit down. It's past 33 years ago. I was privileged to be invited to her wedding. She grew up in Mason, a graduate of Mason High School. Her father was mayor of Mason at one time. Your uncle, I'm sorry, I thought it was your father. Okay, but good roots in Mason and good roots all over Warren County. Matter of fact, I've been talking to her about coming and speaking again. Some of you may recall when she spoke about her grandmother's letters from Paris. In the 1930s, her grandmother, as a high school student, had a pen pal in Paris. And after the graduation, they continued to write back and forth. And as war was approaching, the letters that came were fascinating. Now she tells me she has another relative who grew up about less than 20 miles from here, where Ross or Venice, Ohio is, depending upon what you want to consider that area of Butler County, and how he went out west to the California Gold Rush, is that correct? California. But then he came back a little bit east and met a future wife in California or in South Dakota? In California. Anyway, and there's letters there and there's pictures there, so we will have Suzanne back. She loves talking about world history, European history. And of course, the coronation was in May, and it was fascinating to watch all these things. We may have seen King Charles hold a globe of some sort, one glove, and I'm sure it wasn't doing a Michael Jackson imitation. But she is here. This is the kind of thing she really, really enjoys. And I think you will really, really enjoy what she shows you. Ladies and gentlemen, Suzanne Anderson-Taylor.
Thank you. Before I start with the British coronations, I am a teacher here at Lebanon High School. I teach advanced placement, European history, and pre-AP world history, which is a 9th grade class. And I would like to assure everyone that there are very, very good children out there, and that your future is safe, and that there are still wonderful students that certainly attend Lebanon High School, so have no fear, you are in good hands. But I, like Mr. Zimkus said, John said, I do love world history, and I love British history in particular. I don't know, maybe it's because my middle name's Elizabeth, maybe it's because my mother is a huge Anglophile, but I love the information and the history of the coronations and what that is about. So, oh, whoops, okay. So, sorry, I'm not used to fancy technology. All right, the coronations, they emerged from a European tradition of increasing church involvement in the state, as well as a need to bring stability to the often volatile societies in which several individuals had claimed to the throne. Britain is unique today in that it is the only current European country to hold a coronation ceremony still. Others opt for the simpler inauguration or a church service marking the accession of a new ruler. So this particular map kind of shows you when a lot of the monarchies cease to exist in Europe. Those in the red still have monarchies today, but of course it is the United Kingdoms that stands out. So we are going to start with Westminster Abbey. King Edward the Confessor decided in the 1060s to build a large stone church in London in honor of St. Peter. The church became known as the Westminster to distinguish it from St. Paul's Cathedral, which was known as the Eastminster in the city of London. The new church was consecrated on December 28th, 1065. However, the king was too ill to attend and died on January 5th, 1066. Only traces of Edward's monastery are seen today. However, the oldest door in Britain is at the Westminster Abbey. This door, dated in 2005, was shown that it was from wood felled in the year 1032, and that the door was constructed in the 1050s. The door currently measures 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Originally, it was much larger. It was 9 feet tall and had a rounded arch at the top. So that is the current front and back of the door at Westminster Abbey. There we go. The Pyx Chamber. It is the oldest surviving part of the abbey. It's underneath the monks' dormitory. The chamber still possesses its medieval tiled floor and some of the tiles from the 11th century. The name Pyx is from the wooden boxes in which gold and silver were kept secure in order to await was known as the trial of the Pyx, the melting down of the measured silver content as a way of showing that the coinage was pure. The trial was established in 1281. The stone table that you see on the right, it's not an altar, against the east wall was used to test the silver. So Westminster continued, and in 1245, King Henry III pulled down the eastern part of the 11th century abbey. Henry's devotion to St. Edward the Confessor prompted him to build a more magnificent stone church in the newest Gothic style, and also to provide a new shrine for the saint, near to whom Henry himself could be buried. This church was consecrated on October 13th, 1269. Henry died in 1272 before the nave could be completed. Henry III was originally buried in the old grave of Edward the Confessor. Henry had his bones moved to a new shrine in 1269 that we see here. And then his son, Henry III's son, Edward I, placed him in a splendid tomb north of Edward the Confessor. So every monarch since William the Conqueror has been crowned here, except for two. Edward V, who was one of the two princes of the Tower that died in 1483. They are, according to Shakespeare, were, of course, murdered by their uncle, King Richard III. There are other theories to what happened to them, but they certainly disappeared and were never heard from again in 1483. So Edward V was not crowned, nor was Edward VIII. Edward VIII was the king who abdicated in 1936, and I'll talk about him in a little bit. William and Mary, William III and Mary II, were the only joint monarchs to be crowned here in 1689. Of course, King Charles III was crowned here. He is the 40th monarch in the 39th coronation at Westminster Abbey. So the coronation ceremony, the general framework is based on sections contained in the second recension used in AD 973 for King Edgar. And although there have been two major revisions, a translation and the ceremony's been modified for each coronation, the sequence follows the same pattern. The oath, the anointing, the investing of regalia, and the crowning and enthronement. It has been this way for over 1,000 years following this ancient Anglo-Saxon text. So, the oath. The sovereign enters the abbey and is seated on a chair of estate. The archbishop declares, "Sirs, I have present unto you," the name, "your undoubted king or queen. Wherefore all you who are come this day to do homage and service, are you willing to do the same?" After the people reply, "God save," sovereign's name, the coronation oath is administered. And since 1689 has required the sovereign to promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom of England and the dominions thereto belonging, according to the statutes and parliament agreed on and the laws and customs of the same. So, of course, there is King Charles, who just took the oath in May. The anointment. The sovereign's crimson robe is removed, and the sovereign proceeds to the coronation chair. Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III both elected to not show this most solemn part of the coronation to the public. The sovereign is consecrated from oils that is perfumed with essential oils such as sesame, rose, jasmine, amber, cinnamon, orange blossom, and more. Traditionally, the oil contained civet oil from the glands of small animals and whale intestines. King Charles III, however, chose a vegan-friendly option. His came from the olive oil pressed from olives outside of Bethlehem. The holy oil is poured from the ampulla into the coronation spoon. The ampulla is a solid gold flask in the shape of an eagle, and it was crafted for King Charles II in 1661. The coronation spoon was first recorded in 1349. It is believed to be from the 12th century. the 1100s. It was possibly supplied to King Henry II or Richard I. Its bowl is divided into 2 lobes, engraved with Ancathus scrolls, and has 4 pearls on the handle. In 1649, it was sold off rather than melted down. It was bought by Clement Kinnersley, an official of the royal wardrobe of King Charles I. He bought it for 16 shillings. After the Restoration, he returned the spoon to Charles II, no doubt hoping to win back royal favor. The coronation chair, also known as King Edward's chair, it was commissioned in 1296 by King Edward I. It is to contain the coronation stone of Scotland, known as the Stone of Scone or the Stone of Destiny. Edward's chair is the oldest dated piece of English furniture made by a known artist, Walter of Durham. Gilded lions were added in the 16th century and replaced in 1727. The chair was originally gilded, painted, and inlaid with glass mosaics. Even still today, you can see the outlines of the birds, the foliage, and the animals. In the 18th century, tourists could sit on it in a small fee. And of course, we so famously can see they actually left graffiti on the chair where they've carved into the chair itself. The chair was covered for Queen Victoria in a thick lacquer, which unfortunately they're afraid if they try to take that off, it'll ruin the chair, so it must stay. In 1914, the chair was an object of a bomb attack, possibly done by suffragettes, and a corner of the chair was broken off, but it has since been faithfully restored. So the chair has only been removed twice from the Abbey. One time for Oliver Cromwell when he was inducted as the Lord Protectorate. Briefly, in the 1600s, England decided they no longer wanted to have a monarchy, and so they decided to have what was known as a commonwealth, a protectorate. And so for a brief while, for about 11 years, they did not have a monarch. So that was Oliver Cromwell. And also it was in World War II. It was the crown, or the chair was taken to Gloucester Cathedral to protect it from the bombing of London by the Nazis. And so they put the chair in protection. So like I said, the chair was originally built by Edward in order to hold the Stone of Scone, or the Stone of Destiny. It is an oblong block of red sandstone that was originally used in the coronations of the monarchs of Scotland. It weighs approximately 335 pounds. Legend says that it was the pillow Jacob rested upon his head at Bethel, and that the prophet Jeremiah then took it to Ireland. From Ireland, it is said that it was first brought to Scotland by the first king of the Scots circa 1498. However, geologists have proven since that the stone was actually quarried in the vicinity of Scone, Scotland. Others believe the monks at the Scone Palace hid the real stone in the River Tay or buried it at Dunsany Hill. So when the English troops showed up in the 13th century under the orders of King Edward I to take the stone back to England, that the English troops were actually tricked into taking a substitute, and that the real Stone of Scone has long since been hidden in Scotland. In 1328, a treaty was signed to return the stone to Scotland, but riots outside of Westminster Abbey prevented it from leaving. The monarchs actually used to sit upon the stone itself until the 17th century when a platform was added to the chair. On Christmas Day in 1950, a group of 4 Scottish students removed the stone, intending to return it to Scotland. It was soon discovered that it had actually been broken in half at one point. Many believe it possibly was damaged during the suffragette bombing of 1914. There was a massive search for the stone, and after 4 months, it was found. It showed up in an abbey in Scotland. Apparently, the 4 schoolboys felt a little guilty or maybe got in over their head and thought, we're going to get in some trouble for this. So they just anonymously returned it, and then it was returned to Westminster Abbey. On July 3rd, 1996, however, it was announced that the stone would return to Scotland, and it was handed over on November 15th, 1996. The stone was transported to Edinburgh Castle, where over 10,000 people lined the streets to watch the Stone of Destiny's official return to Scotland for the first time in 700 years. Okay, so back to the ceremony. The investing of the regalia. The Lord Great Chamberlain presents the spurs, the sword of states, the bracelets, and other objects to the monarch. The monarch then puts on the royal robe and the stole royal. The archbishop delivers several crown jewels to the sovereign. The orb is delivered and then immediately returned to the altar. He also, in the case of Charles, received a ring representing his marriage to the nation, the sovereign scepter with the dove, and then the sovereign scepter with a cross. The Archbishop of Canterbury lifts St. Edward's crown before the high altar, sets it back down, and says a prayer. The Dean of Westminster takes the crown to the coronation chair, where the Archbishop reverently places it on the monarch's head. And the guests in the abbey cry 3 times in unison, God save the king or queen. A prayer then is said in Latin as the choir sings. So these are some of the presentations, the spurs, the ring, the sword. Paying homage. This is obviously a holdover from medieval times, but the sovereign rises from the coronation chair and is borne onto a throne. Once the monarch is seated, the act of homage takes place, with archbishops and bishops and then peers proceed to pay homage. Then the rest of the clergy pay homage together, and then members of the royal family. In medieval times, literally every archbishop, bishop, priest, every member of the peerage, every member of the family would individually pay homage. So in today's ceremony, that is narrowed down considerably, symbolically, with just chosen members of each group. If there is a queen consort, then she is anointed, invested, crowned, and enthroned in a simple ceremony immediately. So I think for a lot of people, this was certainly, if you watch the coronation, was a special moment when William, who represented the royal family, of course he is the Prince of Wales, meaning he is the next in line for the throne. So William paid homage to his father, which you could tell between the two of them was a very moving moment for them. The spurs and the bracelets. So the spurs as well is then also held over from medieval times. They were first recorded for King Richard I. They were made, these particular spurs were made in 1661 for Charles II and altered in 1820 for George IV. They used to actually put the spurs on the monarch's ankles, but since the Restoration, only present the spurs to the monarch and return them to the altar. Although the exact purpose of the armis or the oval gold bracelet is unclear, the wording refers to the bracelets as sincerity and wisdom. They are thought to relate to ancient symbols of knighthood and military leadership. They are also symbolic of the bond uniting the sovereign to the people of the kingdom. To the left are the bracelets created in 1661 to replace those lost during the Commonwealth period. To the right are those that were presented to Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 as a symbolic gift from the Commonwealth. The presentation of the swords. There are 3 swords. You have the sword of state, the sword of offering, and the sword of mercy. So notice the sword of mercy is blunt on the tip, symbolizing that the monarch can be merciful. So the swords reflect the monarch's head of the British Armed Forces and the defender of the faith. They are carried before the monarch into the abbey. The 2-handed sword of state, made in 1678, is also carried before the monarch at the state openings of Parliament. The sword weighs 8 pounds and is 4 feet long. The Lion of England and the Unicorn of Scotland form the cross piece of the handle. During the coronation, it must be held for much of the service, pointing upwards without touching the body of the Lord President of the Privy Council. In King Charles III coronation, the Lord President of the Privy Council was Penny Mordaunt. Okay, she became the first woman to present a sword to a monarch. She did confess prior to the ceremony that she did plenty of push-ups in preparation of holding that sword for so long. She did a very impressive job. She carried it into the abbey, exchanged it for the sword of offering for the rest of ceremony, and then carried it before the king as he left the abbey. So the sword of offering was commissioned by King George IV in 1821. The sword's handle is set with 2,141 diamonds, 12 emeralds, and 4 rubies. The stones are arranged to make roses, thistles, shamrocks, oak leaves, and acorns. So the rose is the official symbol of England. A thistle is the official flower of Scotland. And of course, the shamrock is the official symbol of Ireland. King George IV paid more than £5,000 for the sword out of his own pocket, and it was kept in the royal family's personal collection until 1903, when it was then deposited with the crown jewels. So this is the sovereign's orb, again, another medieval symbol. The orb is divided into 3 sections to represent the 3 known continents of the medieval period. It is a representation of the monarch's power, and it symbolizes the Christian world with the cross on top. This particular orb on the right was again created for King Charles II's coronation in 1661. It contains 12 large diamonds, 30 rubies, sapphires, and emeralds. It also contains amethyst, pearls, and enamel. Then we have the sovereign's ring. So it is composed of a mixed cut octagonal sapphire and a gold setting overlaid with 4 rectangular cut and 1 square cut ruby, buffed together in gold setting to form a cross with a border of 14 cushion-shaped diamonds and a diamond on each shoulder with a gold hoop. This ring was made for King George IV, who left it to Queen Victoria, and was left with the crown jewels for King George V in 1919. The ring is placed on the 4th finger of the monarch by the archbishop. Since the 13th century, it has been traditional to include a ruby as the principal stone in the ring. The ring symbolizes the monarch's marriage to their country. In 1837, it was discovered that William IV's ring was too large for Queen Victoria. So a new smaller ring had to be made. The jeweler made an unfortunate mistake in that he made the ring to fit her pinky finger and not the fourth ring finger. So, during the ceremony, the archbishop forced the too small ring onto her fourth finger, which caused it to swell. She had to soak her right hand in ice water to get the ring off. She wrote in her diary, "I had the greatest difficulty to take it off, which I did at last with great pain." So that is King George's ring, which was the ring Charles used, and then that is Victoria's smaller ring there. So this is the sovereign scepter with the dove on top. The scepter represents the sovereign's spiritual role, as the dove, of course, represents the Holy Ghost. Also known as the rod of equity and mercy, this role was emphasized in the ceremony of William the Conqueror in 1066 with this description: "For by the scepter, uprisings in the kingdom are controlled, and the rod gathers and confines those men that stray." So this particular rod, again, was made for Charles II in 1661. The other is the sovereign's scepter with cross. It's comprised of a gold rod formed in 3 sections with enameled collars at the intersections. Besides the Cullinan one, it also has other rose-cut diamonds, rubies, spinels, and emeralds. The pommel is enameled and mounted with rubies, diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires. The scepter was made for Charles II, but has undergone many alterations, particularly for George IV in 1820, when an enameled rose, thistle, and shamrock were added to the mond. The Cullinan one, or the Star of Africa. It was found in 1905 by Frederick Wells, the mine's surface manager, who was alerted to a shiny object glinting in the wall of the mine. The original stone was over 3,000 carats and was named after Thomas Cullinan, the chairman of the Premier, or Transvaal Diamond Mining Company in South Africa. The Transvaal government purchased it, and it was gifted to Edward VII as a symbolic gesture to heal the rift between the British and the South African governments after the Boer Wars of 1901. It was formally handed over to the king on his birthday on November 9th, 1907 at Sandringham. The huge uncut stone was then cleaved by jewelers in Amsterdam. It took them 8 months working 14 hours a day to create 9 major stones and 97 smaller brilliants. The Cullinan one, at 530 carats, is the largest colorless cut diamond in the world. It was first cleaved February 10, 1908. A replica stone guarded by detectives was sent to the mining company's London sales agent by ship. They made a very big deal out of the pomp and circumstance and showing the armed guard and showing the diamond going under protection. In reality, the real diamond was sent by normal post to the United Kingdom, unguarded. Both parcels arrived safely into England. So we'll get back to some of these. This is St. Edward's crown. It weighs nearly 5 pounds, and it was made for Charles II as a replacement for the medieval crown melted down in 1649. The medieval crown dated to the 11th century and had belonged to King Edward the Confessor. The crown worn by Edward the Confessor was kept at the abbey, as he claimed he had asked the monks to look after his regalia in perpetuity. I can never say that word. Forever. For the coronations of all future English kings. A crown referred to as St. Edward's crown was first recorded in 1220 at the coronation of King Henry III. It was also the crown used for Anne Boleyn's coronation, which was unprecedented. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of King Henry VIII. So, of course, King Henry VIII had his 6 wives. That is maybe another story for another time, because it is a fascinating, fascinating story. But he was so determined to legitimize Anne Boleyn as his queen that he actually used St. Edward's crown for her coronation. Some believe the medieval crown was perhaps saved from the melting pot, since the 2 crowns were almost identical in weight and no invoice for materials has ever been found. However, in 2008, gemologists confirmed that this crown was made in 1660. After William III in 1689, monarchs chose to be crowned with a coronation crown or their own state crown, while St. Edward's crown sat on the high altar. So, of course, that is the moment that King Charles is coronated with St. Edward's crown. Edward VII wanted to bring back the tradition of using this crown. However, when he was crowned in 1901, he was still recovering from an operation for abdominal abscesses, and instead had to wear the lighter imperial state crown. Its band was made smaller to fit George V in 1910, who was the first monarch to be crowned with St. Edward's crown in over 200 years. The crown is 12 inches tall, has 44 precious and fine gemstones, such as rubies, amethysts, sapphires, garnets, topaz, and tourmalines. It is considered a holy relic. Therefore, it is only used at the moment of the crowning itself. It also was displayed, which was unique, on the high altar of Westminster Abbey at the service marking the 60th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's coronation. So this is a replica of a state crown. So there have been various state crowns that have been used throughout English history. The great crown with crosses and fleur-de-lis, but without the arches, was the king's usual headgear at state occasions. The Tudor crown was said to have weighed over 7 pounds and had 168 pearls, 58 rubies, 28 diamonds, 19 sapphires, and 2 emeralds. This is a replica that is shown at Hampton Court. There have been 10 versions since the restoration in 1660. One was made for Queen Victoria in 1838, and it's the basis for today's crown. In 1845, the Duke of Argyll was carrying the crown before Queen Victoria when it fell off of the cushion and broke. She wrote in her diary, "It was crushed and squashed like a pudding that had sat down." So in 1919, the crown was altered to accommodate the 317-carat Cullinan II diamond. That's what we see there. So the crown is decorated with 2,868 diamonds, 273 pearls, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, and 5 rubies. The 170-carat Black Prince's ruby is actually a large cabochon spinel. According to legend, it was given to Edward the Black Prince by the Spanish king in 1367, and Henry V wore it at the Battle of Agincourt. How the stone found its way back into the royal collection post-interregnum is unclear, but a substantial ruby was acquired for the crown jewels in 1661 at the cost of 400 pounds, and it very well may have been this spinel that you see up there. On the back of the crown is the 104-carat cabochon Stuart sapphire. It was passed from James II to his son, James Stuart, also known as the Old Pretender. and then his younger son, Henry Benedict, who was the younger brother to Bonnie Prince Charlie. It was purchased by George III in 1807 and returned to the United Kingdom. It was included on Queen Victoria's imperial crown, and in 1909, moved to the back of the crown in order to make way for the Cullinan II. At the top of the cross of St. Edward's, you can see there, is St. Edward's sapphire, reportedly taken from the ring of Edward the Confessor when his body was reinterred at the Abbey in 1163. The stone was used as the main stone in the crown made for King Henry I, who was king in 1100. Below the mound also hang four pearls, 3 of which were said to belong to Queen Elizabeth I. Of course, I think the imperial state crown is probably more famous than Edward's crown because it is the one that the monarch wears to open Parliament, and of course, so famously was put upon Queen Elizabeth II's coffin during her funeral. So I think it's a little more recognized than St. Edward's. The state crown of Mary Modena was made. She was the first consort to be crowned after the Restoration, since King Charles II was unmarried at the time of his coronation. The gold crown originally had 523 small diamonds, 38 large diamonds, 129 large pearls. It weighed 1.5 pounds. Queen Mary II, Queen Anne, plus the consorts to George II and George III all wore this crown. In 1831, it was found to be in a very poor state of repair, and a new crown was made. In 1902, Queen Alexandra had a crown made for her coronation. She was the wife of King Edward VII. The crown departed from the standard style of British crowns and was more akin to European royal styles. She was the Princess of Denmark. It was made of platinum for lightness and had an unprecedented 8 arches. Its front arch joined a jewel, the crown into which was set the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is one of the most famous diamonds in the world, and has a very turbulent history, which can be traced back to the 13th century. It is 105 carats. It originally was larger, but Prince Albert did not like its original cut, so he had it recut into an oval. It was first brought to the United Kingdom as the condition of the Treaty of Lahore in 1849, when it was basically taken from the 10-year-old Maharaja in part of India. It has only been worn by female royals. It is considered to be bad luck for a male to wear this particular diamond. So it has also been used in Queen Mary's crown and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, her crown in 1937. So this is the crown of Queen Mary. She's the consort of George V. She's the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II. She loved jewelry. She loved diamonds in particular. There's not a picture out there of her not just literally dripping in jewelry. She bought the Art Deco-inspired crown from Gerard and Company out of her own pocket, hoping it would be an heirloom for future consorts. It is 9 inches tall and weighs 1 1/3 pounds. The silver gilt crown has around 2,200 rose-cut and brilliant-cut diamonds. It originally contained the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the Cullinan III, and the Cullinan IV. In 1914, the arches were detached so it could be worn as an open crown, which is how Mary wore it after George V died in 1936. In 1937, the Cullinan V was added. So this is the crown that Queen Camilla chose. She altered it by resetting the crown with the original Cullinan III, IV, and V diamonds as a tribute to Queen Elizabeth, who had worn them always as brooches. She had 4 of the 8 arches removed. So they believe that she chose this this crown because The other crown would be controversial with the Koh-i-Noor diamond in it because there are some that feel the English acquired it under some shady circumstances. So she wore this crown instead, and like I said, she had the colonnades 3, 4, and 5 placed into it. These diamonds are usually just worn as simple brooches. I call them simple, as brooches. So this particular one, which you can see Queen Elizabeth wearing on the sash, she referred to those as Granny's chips. And yeah, they're enormous. And then the colonnade 5 was also, could be worn as a brooch. So almost all of the large jewels, even in the crowns themselves, are detachable and removable, and parts of crowns and tiaras can be taken apart, and the brooches can be taken apart. So I guess it's efficient that they recycle their enormous diamonds. But yes, so those are the famous Granny's chips that Elizabeth loved to wear. The crown of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. So this was made for the coronation of George VI. It was made up of 2,800 diamonds, most notably the 105 carat Koh-i-Noor diamond in the middle of the front cross. It was placed upon her coffin for her lying in state and funeral in 2002. So those are just some of the consort crowns. The Tower of London. It was rumored to be built on the same site as a Roman fort that was destroyed by Queen Boudica in AD 61, who was fighting the Romans. Within 3 months of William the Conqueror's coronation, a wooden fort was built here. They're known as a motte and bailey. In 1067, he decided to tear the wooden fort down and gave orders for a large stone tower to be built. And he chose a monk named Gundulf to be the architect. It was intended to be an awe-inspiring, formidable, dominate the city and impress its citizens with the power of the Normans. It was whitewashed to appear even larger. Its first stage was completed in 1078. The oldest part of the Tower of London, which is actually a complex of multiple buildings, is of course the White Tower that we see here on the white. After 1078, in 1091, King William I, his son William Rufus, repaired and strengthened the tower, and then Henry I carried it out further with repairs, and improvements continued throughout the centuries. In 1303, while King Edward I was in Scotland, a gang of robbers smashed down a wall in Westminster Abbey and escaped with 100,000 pounds of treasury. The robbers were never caught, although the abbot and some monks were briefly imprisoned, and the treasure was never found. It was decided at that point to move the royal treasury out of the abbey and into the more secure Tower of London. So they built a jewel house during the reign of King Henry III. Although the coronation regalia was still kept in the Chamber of the Pyx at the Westminster, the other treasury was moved here. A new jewel house was rebuilt in the White Tower. So in 1665, they decided to open up the crown jewels to the public, and for a small fee, you could see and even hold the crown jewels. Well, in 1671, an elderly custodian named Talbot Edwards was tricked by Colonel Thomas Blood and 3 accomplices to overpower him and to take the crown jewels, and they ran off with them. Luckily, the elderly man's son came home right at the end of all of this happening and sounded the alarm, and all the items were recovered, although the crown had been crushed with a mallet and the orb had a dent. It could be saved. And they were arrested. The interesting part of the story is Colonel Thomas Blood was taken before King Charles II on charges of stealing the royal regalia. He was such a smooth talker that not only did he talk his way into being pardoned for stealing the crown jewels, but he also was given back his lands that he had previously lost because in the English Civil War, he was against the royal family and sided with Oliver Cromwell. So he must have been one heck of a salesman because he got all of that back. However, after this incident, drastic changes were made in the security of the jewels, with armed guards being part of it. The jewels were locked in the tower. People could pay a small fee to reach through the gates and actually touch the crown jewels. In 1842, a new building was constructed, but soon after was deemed a fire hazard, so a new building was created in 1868, and that stayed until 1967. In 1967, they decided to build a more secure area that actually was a concrete vault. Visitors had to go down 49 steps underground in order to see the crown jewels. In 1992, it was decided that a new home that was more compatible to public viewing was to be built. For 10 million pounds, they converted almost the entire ground floor of the Waterloo block, formerly barracks. It has 20,000 visitors a day. The crown jewels are protected by bomb-proof glass, 100 hidden CCTV cameras, 22 strong tower guards, and 38 yeoman warders. So the yeoman warders are actually ex-military personnel who live in the Tower of London permanently, which that is still a thing, that there are people that live there. Only the crown jeweler can handle the regalia, except of course for the monarch himself, as we see Queen Elizabeth in a video she did for her anniversary of being queen, just picked up the crown and yanked it around and showed all different parts of it. So this is also at the Tower of London, the gold stagecoach, commissioned in 1760 for King George III's coronation. Was not done in time, but it was used for his son, William IV. It was commissioned for over 7,000 pounds, which is $4 million today. It weighs 4 tons. It's 29 feet long, 12 feet high. The coach needs 8 horses to pull it, and it is so heavy they can only walk when they pull it. William IV described it as being on board a ship tossing in a rough sea. Queen Victoria refused to ride in it on most occasions. George VI said it was one of the most uncomfortable rides I've ever had in my life. And although some updates were made post-World War II, such as rubberizing the iron-bound wheels, Queen Elizabeth said it was still horrible and very uncomfortable, yet impressive to look at. So some of the more famous coronations, this is Edward the Coronation's Edward the Confessor's coronation. This, of course, is the Bayeux Tapestry, which I happen to love and know a lot about, but I won't go in today. But this is the moment that he is being crowned. And of course, that's important because when Edward the Confessor dies, then it is his death that starts kind of a race to see who's going to be the next king. So King Harold thinks he should be king, but he is defeated at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, and William the Conqueror is crowned as the king. So this is William the Conqueror. So William the Conqueror, of course, is from Normandy, France, which is where they were first settled by the Vikings. The Normans settled in northern France because they kept raiding Paris, and Charles the Bald got tired of fighting the Vikings. So he said, look, if I give you some land, will you leave me alone? And they agreed, and so that is where the Normans are from. So William the Conqueror is definitely part of that Viking lifestyle in 1066. So he invades England. He becomes the king. He crowns himself on Christmas Day. That day, of course, was chosen on purpose in 1066. However, when the French-speaking Normans and the English-speaking Saxons shouted their assent or approval of the new king, they were so loud that the guards outside of the abbey feared an uprising. So they went on a rampage and started torching nearby houses. And fire, of course, broke out. The smoke started to fill the church, and the king and the clergymen hastily concluded the service out of fear. So, King William I, or William the Conqueror, served until he died in 1087. And then he was replaced by his son, King Henry I, who then his son was supposed to be the next king. However, King Henry I, his son William, was killed in what was known as the White Ship Incident, which was a drowning off the coast of Normandy in the English Channel. That led his only daughter, the Empress Matilda, to be the next sovereign. And that was, of course, controversial because she was a woman, and a lot of people did not feel like she was an adequate choice. So while King Henry I was alive, he made all of his peers swear homage to her and promised that they would support her as the next Queen of England. However, when he died, Henry I died, most of the peers turned their back on Matilda and instead chose her cousin, Stephen, to be the king. And it was solely because Stephen was a male. Stephen also reached London before Matilda because she was in Normandy and she had also just given birth. And so he reached London on December 8th. The crowds in London claimed they had the right to elect a king and proclaimed him their new monarch. This belief that they had the right to elect a new king goes clear back to Anglo-Saxon times. So the Anglo-Saxons are Germans, and the Germanic tribes had a tradition of having a council that chose a king and then counseled that king. So it was known as the Witegemat, or the Witan, in Anglo-Saxon England. And that is part of the reason why Parliament existed in England when it did, so much sooner than other countries of Europe that didn't have legislative branches. It goes back to the Witegemat. So they declared him their king. However, when they did that, they also caused what is known as the anarchy. The anarchy lasted from 1139 to 1154. It was also referred to as the time when Christ and his saints slept because it was such a brutal civil war. The Civil War finally ended, though, when King Stephen agreed that once he died, his cousin could become King Henry II. And so that's how that was finally settled. So we're going to skip a few generations ahead to Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks, or the Hammer of the Scots. And of course, he is the one that asked for the coronation chair to be made, and he is also the one that stole the Stone of Scone from Scotland and brought it back to England. When he was actually proclaimed king, he was on his way home from crusade. He was on the island of Sicily. But even though he wasn't there, they still officially proclaimed him king. That was the first time that happened, where the king was actually not in England. But England was secure enough that he could take his time. He was actually not coronated until 2 years later in August of 1274. So Edward I then, of course, made the coronation chair. So not going to go into it because it would be a whole nother talk, but there was something called the War of the Roses, where two families, the Yorks and the Lancasters, are fighting for control. Eventually, it is King Edward VII that gets control, and he ends the War of the Roses two ways. One, he defeats King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, And then he marries Elizabeth of York. That unites the York and the Lancaster families. And the War of the Roses is over. He is coronated in 1485 and issued an edict that said any gentleman who swore fealty to him would be secure in his property and that he would not hold the Civil War against him. So England moved forward. Of course, his most famous son, and one of the more famous monarchs, is King Henry VIII. So King Henry VIII, I don't know if you know this, was not actually born to be the heir. He had an older brother named Arthur who died. And 10-year-old Henry then became the heir to the throne. Not only was he not heir to the throne, but actually his brother Arthur, at the age of 14, had married Catherine of Aragon, who was only 16. So when Arthur died, about 3 months after their marriage, no one really quite knew what to do with Catherine of Aragon. It was then decided that when Henry came of age, 18, that he would marry his brother's wife. And that is what happened. King Henry VII died in 1509, and Henry became King Henry VIII. He then married Catherine of Aragon on June 11th, and on June 23rd, they were coronated at the Abbey. So, of course, his 3 children followed him. Henry, of course, so famously wanted a son. He did have 1 son and 2 daughters, the most famous being Queen Elizabeth. She was coronated after her half-sister Mary died in 1559. She was welcomed wholeheartedly by the citizens and greeted by orations and pageants of the most strong Protestant flavor. However, she was crowned and anointed by the Catholic Bishop of Argyle. Queen Elizabeth never married. She considered herself to be married to England. So as a result, when she passed away in 1603, there was no direct descendant. So her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, became King James I of England. So he arrived in London and is coronated July 25th, 1603. But the plague was going on in London, and so it greatly restricted his festivities. Once he passed away, his son became King Charles I, but his wife refused to be coronated. So it's rather confusing, but at this time, Henry VIII, of course, was Catholic, and then he started the Protestant Church of England, and there was a lot of problems because James was raised a Protestant, Charles was raised a Protestant, but there were lots of rumors that in his heart of hearts he was actually a Catholic. The biggest problem, though, that Charles had was that he did not want to listen to Parliament. And so a civil war breaks out in England, and eventually what happens on January 30th, 1649, King Charles I was executed. They said when the executioner's axe took off his head that the whole crowd gasped and went silent. Like, what did we just do? Did we just really kill our monarch? And they were almost in shock. But he was executed, the only English monarch to have been executed. Of course, Oliver Cromwell then decides to run a protectorate, and he was proclaimed as the protectorate. And then he dies in 1658. Initially, his son was trying to take over as the next protectorate. Basically, Parliament said, well, look, if we're going to have a hereditary son just take over, why not just go back to the legitimate monarch? So they asked Charles II to come back as king. Some refer to him affectionately as the King of Bling, because that's exactly what he brought back. So keep in mind that this time here of 1660, think about American history. You think about the Pilgrims and the Puritans who were leaving England. He is a big reason why, because he decided to bring back the church. And although he didn't bring back the Catholic Church, he brought back a lot of the fancy ceremonies that Puritans and Pilgrims did not really appreciate. And so many of them started to leave and, of course, come to the United States. So Charles II In the spring of 1660, was asked to come back as king. On his 30th birthday, he reached London. He promised to rule in cooperation with Parliament. He showed leniency to most of the followers of Cromwell, although the strangest thing I think he did was he had Oliver Cromwell dug up and decided to decapitate his head and put it on Westminster Abbey's gates as kind of proof as to what you should not do against the king, which was a little odd. His head actually stayed up there for over almost 2 decades. They left the head up there. I know, it's strange. The cost of his coronation was over £12,000. This was one of the last times the traditional procession started at the Tower of London and took place then at Westminster Abbey. Samuel Pepys, who wrote his famous diary, said, "It was so glorious with gold and silver, we were not even able to look at it." So Charles II died in 1685 without a legitimate heir, which is interesting because he had 22 children, none of them with his wife. Yep. So his younger brother, King James II, became king in 1685. He was married twice. His first wife, and he had 2 daughters, Mary and Anne. They were raised Protestant in the Church of England. Unfortunately, the first wife died, and he married a second time, Mary of Modena. She was his wife when he was coronated, although she did not want to participate in the ceremony because it was not a Catholic ceremony. So what happened was he became king in 1685. By 1688, Parliament was not really feeling his ruling. He was too Catholic, and they were starting to question some of his procedures when his wife became pregnant and gave birth to a boy. And that's when Parliament panicked, because according to law of primogeniture, boys always rule before girls. He had 2 adult daughters who were Protestant, and as long as they were next in line, Parliament was happy. But now that he had a son who was obviously going to be raised in the Catholic Church, everyone became very concerned. So, like I tell my students, James II was given a choice. He was told, you can quietly step down or perhaps follow in the footsteps of your father. So he initially seemed to want to put up a fight and then decided not to. He made his escape onto the Thames River, where he famously threw his royal seal into the river. Parliament declared that James, having fled to France and dropping the Great Seal into the river, had effectively abdicated. And so they asked his oldest daughter, Mary, and her Protestant husband, William of Orange, which is part of the Netherlands, to come and be co-regents in England, which they did. So this is William and Mary, but the college is named here in the United States for them. She is technically Mary II, and he is William III. They were offered the joint monarchy, the only precedent dated back to Queen Mary I and King Philip of Spain. He would take the title of king, but Parliament made it very clear there were restrictions on his power. The Bishop of London crowned them together at Westminster Abbey on April 11th, 1689. Neither William nor Mary enjoyed the ceremony. She thought it was all vanity, and William called it popish. She died in 1694, and he died in 1702. They did not have any living children. The Act of Settlement was declared in 1701, and it said that if William and Mary had no children and Anne had no children, the throne would go to Sophia, Electress of Hanover, a granddaughter of James I, and her heirs. Anne was crowned in 1702. She was carried in a huge open sedan because she had gout so bad. She died in 1714. She did not have any living children. Anne had been pregnant 17 times. She had one son that lived to be 11, and then he died. So then the throne passed to the Hanover. So this is how we get George I, who was so German, he never learned to speak English, even though he's the King of England. And then his son, George II, then George II's son was Frederick, and he died, and his George II's actual grandson became king, George III. And of course, we all remember George III fondly as the last king of America. So he became king in 1760. He then married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and they were coronated together. They had 15 children. In the summer of 1788, the king's mental health was a big concern for Parliament. So they debated what to do. They really didn't do too much at the time because he came out of it. However, in 1810, the king's mental health once again broke down, and the Prince of Wales became the Prince Regent. So he basically was a co-ruler with George III. George IV's coronation was the largest ever held at the time. It cost £243,000. It was originally scheduled for August 1st, 1820. However, on June 5th, his estranged wife, Caroline, whom he had not gotten along with for years, returned from Europe. They lived apart. And she said she wanted to be crowned as consort. But George did not want it. He tried to get Parliament to say that she could not be crowned queen consort because she was an adulteress, and so therefore she should not be the consort. The coronation was postponed, but then finally had to be held. On the day of the coronation, the Queen, Caroline, actually showed up at Westminster Hall. The Queen approached on the arm of Lord Hood, but was asked for her ticket by the commander of the guard. Replying she was the Queen and did not need a ticket, she was firmly turned away. They tried to enter a side door, and it was slammed in their faces. Their attempt to find another entrance was blocked by lines of armed soldiers. After 20 minutes, they approached the door that led to Poets' Corner. Lord Hood addressed the doorkeeper, said, "I present to you your queen. Do you refuse her admission?" The doorkeeper replied that he could not admit anyone without a ticket. After further argument, the Queen and her party left. She died 2 weeks later. There were over 4,000 guests at William IV's coronation. It was incredible. His robe cost £24,000. It was 27 feet long and was sold to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum after the ceremony, but then was eventually brought back into the royal family. All right, so this is the coronation of Queen Victoria. Her uncle, William IV, died, and she was coronated in 1838. She planned a coronation as thrifty as George IV's had been extravagant. So much so, it was nicknamed the penny crowning. However, it was no less impressive. One eyewitness wrote, "Be assured, as a pageant, it was unsurpassed in all of history." It cost only £70,000. She was deeply touched by the enthusiasm of around 500,000 people who turned out for the coronation. So that's Victoria. Her son had to wait, well, now the second longest ever, to be king, but he is King Edward VII. So of course, like I said before, he wanted to use St. Edward's crown, but he had suffered from abdominal abscesses. He was quite the drinker, smoker. He had quite the party life. And so the coronation was postponed from June until August. There were 8,000 guests at his coronation. However, the Archbishop of Canterbury was 81, not well in health. He actually died a few months after the coronation. But he refused to give up any of his duties. Therefore, he had to be supported during the entire time. After kneeling to pay homage to the king himself had to help the Archbishop stand back up. And the Archbishop put the imperial state crown on the king backwards. So, yes. So next we have George V, who again, not born to be heir to the throne, but his older brother Albert died in 1892. A little reminiscent of Arthur and Henry. Mary, Queen Mary of Teck, she actually was engaged to Prince Albert, the Prince of Wales, and when he died, again, it was a question of, well, what happens next? And again, the decision was made, well, she would just marry the new Prince of Wales, and so she did. So Mary of Teck married her fiance's brother in 1893. They were coronated in June of 1911, one of the last great events attended by the royal representatives of the great families of Europe. Of course, in 1914, World War I breaks out. It is also George V that issued the royal proclamation that declared that the house and family shall be styled and known as the house and family of Windsor instead of the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. So he is the one that changed the family name. His son was King Edward VIII, who never was coronated. So the coronation ceremony was supposed to take place, and as they were planning it, he was so disinterested in it, he actually asked, do we have to have the ceremony? Can we just dispense of it? They said, no, you need to have a ceremony, so they agreed for a shorter one. The whole time it was being planned, his brother, ironically, stepped in and played his part because King Edward VIII that summer was out cruising with Wallis Simpson. By October, Wallis Simpson had filed for divorce from her second husband, and by November, Edward had told the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, I intend to marry Wallis Simpson. Stanley Baldwin said, if you do that, then the people are not going to support you. Parliament is not going to support you. You cannot marry a divorcee, and certainly not an American divorcee, and expect to be the head of the church. He said, you are going to either have to abdicate or not marry her. And he so famously said that he could not live without her. And so he announced on December 11th, 1936, that he was abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, which of course he did. That is their wedding picture. So although he was king, he was never coronated. Instead, his coronation was fulfilled by his brother. So his brother then became the heir apparent, and then quickly, and that was December of 36, so he is coronated May 12th, 1837. So most of the traditional elements were brought in that his brother did not want, and he decided to have a lot of the traditions and furnishings and clothing of George V to be used again. So Queen Mary is the first Queen Dowager to attend. So that is a picture of her there with the future Queen Elizabeth, and then Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, at the coronation, of course. So Queen Elizabeth became queen February 6, 1952. She, of course, was in Africa when she got word that her beloved father had died, and she was devastated. The coronation was not held until June 1953. She wanted time to mourn her father before even beginning to plan the coronation. So her coronation was held. It cost around $1.5 million. It's the first British coronation to be fully televised, except for the anointment ceremony. Her father's ceremony was the first to be on the radio. Hers was the first to be on television. There were approximately 8,000 invited guests from 129 countries. The ceremony was 3 hours long. It was rumored that some of the peers kept sandwiches in their robes because it was so long. As you can see from Charles's face, it was taking a while. She chose to, of course, her beautiful gown here was designed by Norman Hartnell, and it's white satin, and it had the English rose, the Scottish thistle, the Welsh leek, and the Irish shamrock. as well as symbols from other Commonwealth countries. It took them 8 months to design and make this dress. When she arrived at the cathedral at 11 a.m., she found that the friction between the 6 yards of hand-woven silk velvet cloak and the abbey's carpet, she could not move herself forward, and she had to say to the Archbishop of Canterbury, "Get me started," so she could start down. So, absolutely gorgeous. She chose to wear the coronation necklace that you can see in these pictures here of her official coronation with the orb and the scepter. The coronation necklace is stunning. It's 26 diamonds. The 25th diamond in the necklace is 11 and a half carats that we see down here. It is a Lahore diamond. So it's huge. And you can kind of see with Queen Alexandra, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and the mother, and Queen Elizabeth, how large the coronation necklace is. So impressive. And of course, the coronation of Charles. He ascended the throne on the death of his mother, September 8th, 2022. He's the longest serving British heir apparent and the oldest person to become monarch at 73. Coronation was on May 6th. There were approximately 2,200 guests from 203 countries. And break with tradition, Charles's coronation vestments, or ceremonial clothes, were largely reused from previous coronations. Charles also, at his behest, it's the first time the ceremony included leaders from Jewish, Sunni, and Shiite Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jain, Baha'i, and Zoroastrian religious communities. He wanted to show the variety of religions that were in the Commonwealth. Charles signed his coronation oath, including that he would seek to foster an environment in which people of all faiths and beliefs may live freely. So there he is at the moment of coronation, and then, of course, there he is in his official picture. And that is him and Camilla. So Camilla's gown, I thought, was kind of neat. And the circles, those are the names of her grandchildren. And then she also had her 2 beloved dogs sewn into the bottom of it as well. So that's what that is. So this is another official showing the royal family. We see Edward, Duke of Kent. So these are first cousins to Queen Elizabeth. And then, of course, we see Princess Anne, who is the sister to King Charles, William and Kate, and then Sophie and Edward as well. So the monarchy seems to be in good hands, of course, with the Prince of Wales, William, and then his oldest son, George. They're very popular with the royalty and with the public, as is the rest of their family as well. My husband always says to me, "What do they do? Why do you care?" Well, one thing is you can't open Parliament without the monarch. That's one thing that they officially have to do. But the other thing is they literally bring in billions of dollars of tourism money to the United Kingdom and certainly keep the United Kingdom relevant in some aspects. So someday maybe we'll be watching the coronation of William and or George. So that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so very much, Suzanne. Does anybody have any questions of Suzanne? I've got one. I've heard Camilla was supposed to be the queen consort, and then she became the queen. First, what's the difference between the two terms, and why the change?
Queen consort is just the spouse of the king. The change came before Elizabeth died. Queen Elizabeth II died. She wrote an official letter saying she wanted Camilla to be just the queen and not consort, as many feel like a favor to Charles. If Princess Diana was still alive, even though they were divorced, I doubt Camilla would have been crowned queen But she was, so.
Well, thanks again, Suzanne. Folks, I want to tell you one thing real quick. One of the guests here mentioned we've done a lot of things to this room. You may notice there's the Dooning Family Auditorium. Bill Dooning, our former president of the Historical Society, and his wife Jane have always been big supporters, but they are turning this into an Art Deco designed room. We're a little bit over halfway done. You can see the mirrors here, new curtains, and there will be some other things going on. So it is really becoming a very, very distinctive place to have gatherings like the Lunch and Learn, and not just an open room in an old post office. So thank you so very much for joining us, and hope to see you next month. Take care.
Oh, you're welcome.